All right. 7:02, we'll give folks maybe one more minute to come on. Yeah, I think I heard someone say like 3 minutes is sort of the equivalent, the Zoom equivalent of starting an in-person meeting 5 minutes late. So, so we're at 7:03. Great. All right. Well, actually, I will hand it over to our moderator tonight. Dira, you can kick things off. Just let me know when you want me to switch the chat slide.
Perfect. All right. Welcome everyone to our Building Resilience Across the Charles River webinar. Today's agenda, next slide please, Julie. For today's agenda, we're gonna start with a brief intro of all of our speakers. We will then move on into the project overview for the flood model across the watershed. You'll then see an example and hear from a municipal within our watershed about their experiences in this project. And then we're going to go into the engagement process and opportunities involved. As we know, community engagement and input is really critical in building equitable resiliency. And then we will end with a call to action for public input as well as a Q&A. So as we are going through the webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen to add any questions for the panelists. And if you need any technical help, you can either email charles@crwa.org, or you can use the chat function and that will send messages directly to us if you need any help. And we will have poll questions throughout the presentation, so be prepared for that. And if you need any help, just let us know. We also want to let you know that there is an option to show subtitles for today's webinar, and you can turn that on when you click the 3 buttons that says more at the bottom of your panel. And I see that some people have already asked, but recording of this webinar will be available after this event. Next slide, please, Julie. So many of you may already know us, but if you are new to the Charles River Watershed Association, we are CRWA. We are one of the oldest watershed associations in the country. We were founded by a group of concerned citizens and residents in 1965. And we work with a lot of federal and state agencies, as well as the 35 watershed municipalities. We have an interdisciplinary staff and cover a number of program areas, as you can see on the list. And at CRWA, our mission is to protect, restore, and enhance the Charles River and its watershed through science, advocacy, and the law. We've come a long way since the days of the dirty water, but as you'll learn, we still have a long way to go. Let's see, next slide, Julie. So before we delve into the project, I would like to start with a land acknowledgement. At CRWA, we humbly acknowledge that the CRWA resides on occupied territory of the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag peoples. We recognize and acknowledge them as the past, present, and future caretakers of the land in which our work carries across. Next slide. So for today, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Dira Johanneth. I am the Program Associate for Community Resilience at CRWA, and I will be your moderator tonight. We also have Julia Hopkins, who is our Communications Manager. She will be kind of behind the scenes helping us with any technical needs. And our first panel, we have Julie Wood, who is the Deputy Director at the Charles River Watershed Association. So Julie is a longtime member of CRWA staff. She joined us in 2007. Julie oversees our science program, which includes our climate change adaptation, stormwater program, river science, as well as our education and outreach program. She is the project manager for the Charles River flood model that you'll be hearing about tonight. And she also supports our advocacy work and often presents CRWA's work at conferences with local officials or committees, as well as at public events. Julie has a BA in mathematics from Boston College and a master's in environmental science from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Our next panel is Marianne Iarossi, and she is from the town of Natick. She is the open space projects planner, and she is a certified AICP planner through the American Planning Association with 10 years of experience in environmental and open space planning. She formerly served on the Hudson Conservation Commission and Hudson Community Preservation Committee, and currently sits on DCR's Mass Recreational Trails Advisory Board. In the town of Natick, she is working on a variety of stewardship and open space initiatives, including managing the design of the last Costituent Rail Trail link to Natick Center, growing the local trail network, and exploring creation of mini woodlands, as well as seeking innovative ways for Natick to conserve its last remaining green spaces. Our last panelist is Leigh Meunier. I hope I said that right. She is CREW, or Communities Responding to Extreme Weather's project coordinator. Leigh is fairly new to the staff at CREW, but she's been volunteering with them since 2018, both as an organizer for their annual Climate Interface Summit and a member of the local CREW chapter in Somerville. She's had the honor of serving her community in many capacities, including public education, songwriting and performance, community organizing, grant management, and even ecological landscaping. She feels most joyful and in flow when she gets to be creative, curious, and connected to nature, and when she can support others in accessing these as well. With her stellar team at CREW, Leigh will be coordinating much of the community engagement work related to the Charles River Flood Model Project, with her eye and heart on ways to engage people through the watershed authentically, equitably, and through mutual learning. So I hope everyone got that, but you'll hear more from our panelists. And before I pass the torch to Julie, we're actually going to run our first poll question. And Julia, if we can run our first one. So our first poll question, or two poll questions, is whether you are concerned about flooding in your community, if your flooding in your community is getting worse with climate change, and if you have personally been affected by flooding. So we're going to give it a couple minutes for, or 1 or 2 minutes for people to answer the poll. Maybe we'll give it 30 more seconds for people to answer, and then we'll close the poll and show everyone the results. All right, so I'm going to end the poll and share the results. Everyone should be able to see it. It looks like majority of attendees here say they are concerned about flooding in their community getting worse with climate change. And a number of attendees have felt personal flooding, but a majority have not felt personal flooding. Great. And now I'll pass it off to Julie.
Great, thank you so much, Dira. And just another shout out to Dira and Julia, my team here at CRWA, who are helping make this possible. As I'm sure many of you know at this point, a lot goes into these Zoom events. All right. I don't know why there's a slight delay in my slides here, but hopefully that won't persist. So thank you again so much for joining us. I see some of the names I recognize and some new names. Happy to have so much interest in this project. It's really wonderful to see so many folks taking time out of their night. So also a shout out to you all. So my piece of the presentation, this is just a quick overview of what I'm going to discuss tonight. A little history and background on the development of what we call our Charles River flood model, which hopefully you will be very familiar with at the end of tonight if you aren't already. What we've learned from this work to date, our current and ongoing work, and then I'm going to hop back on right at the end to just do a final request for input. As you'll hear when I talk about the sort of development of the model, the early phases, we did rely a lot on resident engagement and community input to help us make a lot of the decisions that need to be made in a project like this. And the same thing is going to be the case going forward. So it really does help us when we get input from interested folks. And then I also just want to thank the Executive Office on Energy and Environmental Affairs Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program that has funded this work. So that is a state of Massachusetts program that has funded this work. Okay, so climate change in Massachusetts. This is from the state's Climate Hazard and Mitigation Plan. We expect our climate to change in a number of ways, which will result in multiple related natural hazards. And tonight we're really going to focus on these two, inland flooding and changes in precipitation and extreme weather events. So a little background, in August of 2019, Charles River Watershed Association formed what we call the Charles River Climate Compact. And this was a group that brings together municipal representatives, staff, some volunteers. So it brings together the communities of the Charles River Watershed to work on climate adaptation. And we really focused on doing that through two mechanisms. One was just by sharing information with each other. A lot of climate planning happens at the municipal level. And so providing this space where community representatives could learn from one another so that they're not always inventing everything from scratch or feeling like they have to invent everything from scratch. So an opportunity for information sharing, as well as taking on projects that really made sense to take on at the watershed scale. You know, some projects, it does make sense to maybe just do in one community. But when you're talking about flooding, which we are, it definitely makes sense to talk about the watershed scale, because a watershed by definition defines where the water flows and where it ends up. And so one community that is upstream of another community, changes they make, decisions they make, can and will impact flooding in downstream communities. So it really needs to be a regional conversation. Our current membership is 22 total. There's 35 municipalities that are in the watershed. Some of them, however, just very small portions of the town is in the watershed. And we are not the only regional climate collaborative there's a few others, including neighboring watersheds like the Mystic and the Suasco. So, you know, some communities, if they have more area in a different watershed, may be more engaged in another one. When we first came together, we sort of invited everybody to come together. Again, this is back in August 2019, you know, a whole different world, but We had an actual in-person meeting, and we kicked off with a listening session, and we really asked people what what issues do you see? Where do you see this group potentially being helpful? So they identified as one challenge that they face is the lack of information about local impacts. Like what really are we going to see from climate change? Having that information will obviously make it easier for us to plan. And then they identified the opportunity to coordinate with their neighbors as a real opportunity. And so basically this group has been working together ever since then. And even for dating back to that very first, the very first few meetings we had back in 2019, we really started to build consensus around pursuing a project that addressed flooding on a regional basis. That really made sense to folks because of all the upstream, downstream connections with flooding. So we were able to get some funding, as I mentioned, from the MVP Action Grant Program to develop the Charles River flood model. And so last June, we completed what we called our flood model phase 1 project. And just a quick summary of what that entailed. We developed the Charles River flood model, which is a useful climate planning tool. We used it to better understand and better inform what the impacts what the flooding impacts of climate change will be locally on us and our communities and our watershed. We also tested out some possible mitigation strategies, a good way to be able to kind of test something, see if it works before necessarily spending a lot of money on it. And then we engaged watershed residents along the way, particularly at key decision points where we were deciding what to run through the model. So do we want to run, 10 inches of rain, 3 inches of rain, and see the impacts of, what kind of storms we want to see the impacts of, and then what kind of flood mitigation strategies do we want to see the impacts of? So if you were someone who participated in providing input in the first phase, thank you so much. And it definitely informed what we modeled. Once the model was developed, it definitely informed what we modeled. If anyone is interested in learning a little bit more about the technical elements of the model, some of our presentation, our virtual events from phase 1 do go into that a bit more. So I would encourage folks to check those out on our website if you want to hear more technical details. Okay, so fast forwarding to the results. So this on top is just a screenshot of what the flood model looks like. You can go in and explore your neighborhood, explore your community. When you look at it, you'll see a legend. So we were able to look at flooding and a bunch of different rainfall scenarios or different storm sizes. And then another thing we looked at was critical facilities that might be flooded under different storm events. And then these are a few other metrics we looked at: acres of flooded area, and then volume of flooded runoff. So this is all the data we got from phase 1. These 2-year, 10-year, and 100-year storm events, so folks might have heard that term before. Some of you might be very familiar with it. But this means sort of statistically what type of storm might you see about once every 2 years or about once every 100 years. In reality, the 100-year storm has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. So these are based on past historic rainfall events, just looking at the rainfall record over years and years and years. So when you see present here in the table, that means sort of the present day 2-year storm. However, given that those are based on past rainfall, historic rainfall, we know that's changing. So we also used methodology that is developed by the state to determine what a 2-year storm 50 years from now might look like. So these are our future events. Unsurprisingly, the flooding is getting worse in every in every scenario. So that is not unsurprising. Larger storms, more flooding. And this just shows a little bit, you know, this six-hour 10-year event. These are all 24-hour events, meaning the rain would fall in 24 hours. Again, theoretical statistical storms, but for this 6-year, 10-year event, we see that it's already gotten worse when we look at 1961 to 2015. And then same thing with the 24-hour 100-year event. It's already gotten worse. So we're already seeing that. And then we are going to see it get even worse, unfortunately. So this is what the model looks like. I think Diro is able to chat out the link to folks. Definitely encourage you to take a look, find your house, find your neighborhood, check out what it says for present day flooding, see if that kind of matches with your experience. Obviously, this is a computer model, so it's good to get feedback from folks if they, if it's not really matching with your flooding experience, and then also check out those future projections. And you can always access this from our website, crwa.org. Just scroll down to staying current and click on watershed modeling and flood predictions. So just to zoom in here, just in case that legend was a little hard to read. This is the most extreme event we looked at, a 100-year event that was similar to what was modeled in the Mystic River, which some of our communities are in both watersheds. So we did a similar storm, 11.9 inches in 24 hours. And then the legend shows you where is it more than 3 feet of flooding, where is it more than 2 feet, more than 1 feet. And so very interactive. Okay, and then I mentioned in addition to modeling just storm events, we also modeled some flood mitigation strategies or scenarios. So we looked at green infrastructure, green stormwater infrastructure, things like rain gardens. We looked at reducing impervious cover. We looked at conserving land, or in this case, the potential impacts of not conserving land, and increased tree canopy. So this table is from our website if you want to find out more information on the actual modeling scenarios, and I think my fellow speakers are going to talk about these as well. Just a quick summary, none of the scenarios we modeled actually did enough to reduce the future predicted flooding, even down to present day levels. So kind of what that tells us is flooding mitigation efforts really will need to be fairly extensive. We can't necessarily be thinking about what's feasible from a 2022 standpoint. We really do need to start thinking about these impacts that are coming in the coming decades, and switch our mindset a little bit and really think about how we can be aggressive to address this. And the flood model, it is a great tool to test things out before investments are made. So what's next? Where are we now? We're in phase 2. We're going to update the model, test some new scenarios, including some site-specific designs. And then the culmination will be putting all this work, as well as some of the lessons learned from phase 1, into a flood reduction plan. And continuing community engagement, again, helping us inform both the modeling scenarios and then that planning document. You might be wondering if your town is participating. These are the 20 communities that are participating specifically in the flood model project this round. So in the first round, we had fewer, we've grown a bit. So it's great. It's really great to be engaging. And there is a need. So this is our scope of work for those of you that are interested in this kind of thing. I'm going to talk just a little bit about this task 2 here, identifying and prioritizing projects, flood mitigation projects, because, well, one reason is that's a piece we are actively working on right now. And another reason is that is probably a piece, or definitely, I should say, a piece that you are going to be hearing from us about again, and that we look forward to having more community engagement on. So we have been working to identify some flood mitigation projects across the watershed, or sites across the watershed that might be good for flood mitigation projects. And so we looked at how some others had done this. We identified some criteria specific to this project, developed a scoring methodology, collected project ideas. So we will actually be asking you folks if you know of any flood mitigation projects in your communities at the end of today. And then we're using this methodology that we developed to prioritize projects. So it's a 2-tiered methodology. We're looking for projects that are feasible, have good flood reduction benefits, and have good community support. And then in tier 2, we'll get a little more detailed, looking at things like biodiversity, recreation, permitting feasibility. Permitting can be a challenge, and regional co-benefits. What kind of projects are we looking for? Generally trying to find larger sites, larger projects, where the landowner is supportive, the community is supportive. Ideally, no to very few site conflicts, I should say, upstream of environmental justice communities, so protecting those that might be the most vulnerable to flooding. And then in an area, obviously, that shows flooding, so that it does actually have a flood benefit. All right, so just wrapping up with my portion here on our phase 2 modeling scenarios. We're going to be looking at both some local scale, so we'll get into more detail in a few parts of the watershed, as well as doing some additional modeling at the watershed scale. And then this column here is really the kind of things we're going to be asking for your all's input on. So what flood mitigation strategies should we look at? You know, might be different at the local scale and the watershed scale. What rain events should we look at? What's interesting to you, or what do you think your community should be thinking about? You know, what, in your experience, where does the most flooding, what kind of storms bring the most flooding? So you all are the local experts in that. All right, these are fast moving projects. We need to end when the state ends their fiscal year. So we will actually be completing all of this by June 2022. We will be doing another big webinar style event like this to share our results. Everything will get on the web. However, we will have additional meetings, probably not webinar style, probably meeting style, so we can have a little more interaction about some of these project sites and these site-specific flood mitigation projects. So I invite you all to be engaged in that. All right, and with that, I will hand it over to Marianne.
Thanks, Julie. Let me just get my slides going here. All good?
You are good. We can see it.
Okay, great. Good evening, everyone. My name is Marianne Iarossi. I'm the Open Space Projects Planner with the Town of Natick. I'm here to give everyone a municipal perspective on the project. Natick, the Town of Natick is the lead community on the grant and on the project, partnering with Julie and her team at Charles River Watershed Association, and then the 18 or 19 other communities involved. So half of Natick falls within the Charles River Watershed. As Julie mentioned, there are other watersheds in Massachusetts, so the other parts of Natick fall within the Swasco watershed. This map here shows Natick outlined in red, and then the Charles River is outlined in this darker blue color in southeast Natick. Back in 2018, the town underwent 2 processes that set the stage for us for climate adaptation. And that was the hazard mitigation plan update and the municipal vulnerability preparedness process, which is a mouthful. Julie talked about the MVP program a little bit. That's a state program that provides funding for communities in the state to undergo conversations in the community surrounding how we can adapt better for future climate impacts. So Natick underwent this process in 2018. We gathered a ton of stakeholders and residents in the community and had some conversations in terms of what we're seeing in town and where these impacts are occurring. At the end of that process, we determined that precipitation-based and riverine flooding was our top hazard, and that South Natick and the Charles River were identified as top areas of concern. We see flooding across town everywhere, as I'm sure most of you have experienced in your communities in some capacity, but it seemed like there was a lot more flooding that has been occurring in the Charles River watershed portions of Natick. Apparently there's a delay on my slides too. Okay. So Julie talked about some of the high-level data that came out of the Charles River flood model under our phase 1 process. And there's a lot of data if you have the opportunity to play around with the model. It's really fun to look at where you live and see what's going on, but there's a lot of information there to absorb. So what I did is I boiled this down a little bit to talk about some of the takeaways that we got in Natick after looking at the model results. And at the local level, we didn't see significant changes, but this reiterates the fact that impacts are greater when we look at them regionally. So from the current day 10-year event to the 2070 10-year event, region-wide in the Charles River watershed, we plan on seeing about 23% increase in flood-prone areas, 45% increase runoff volume, additional 1,600 acres that would not be flooded today that could be flooded in the future, and many more forms of critical infrastructure and buildings that would be flooded. And as mentioned earlier, we modeled a number of these nature-based solutions, such as the green infrastructure solution. And again, at the Natick level, there wasn't specific or significant changes, but when you look at it at a greater impact, greater lens, the impacts are greater. So installing green infrastructure on 20% of land, and green infrastructure are things like pervious surfaces like lawns or tree box filters or rain gardens, pervious paving. When you install green infrastructure on 20% of land, then we would see a reduction in the number of impacted critical facilities, flooding extents, and total runoff. And then developing and turning half of the remaining undeveloped land in the region into impervious surface, we would see a worsening impact. So the number of impacted critical facilities would increase, flooding extents would increase, and total runoff volume would increase by 54%, which is pretty large number here. And again, just reiterating the importance we've realized of implementing region-wide projects versus local, because we know that our natural water system doesn't flow within the town boundaries. They flow within the watershed. So when we have a rain event or flooding, or how the rivers and streams flow that we know very well, this is all part of the watershed. So we have to work together at a regional level to implement these projects and make an actual impact. When we underwent the MVP process in 2018, we identified that flooding was our top hazard and that South Natick and the Charles River were our top areas for that hazard. We also identified what we could do. So we laid out a number of these action items in terms of how to mitigate future climate impacts, specifically related to flooding. And that included things such as installing green infrastructure, adopting new policies, educating the public, conserving land, etc. This overlaps already with a lot of the work that we do. So for example, a couple of years ago, we adopted a new stormwater bylaw, and we try to be pretty aggressive in our land protection efforts. And we also can use this knowledge and this work in our permitting processes. So permits that might go before the planning board for large scale projects, we can use results of the Charles River flood model in that review. For the purposes of the Charles River Flood Model Phase 2 project, which brings us all together tonight, we're exploring right now, as Julie mentioned, on the ground projects to put forth for design and hopefully eventually construction. And this addresses some of those Natick goals back in 2018 that we developed that are related to mitigating climate change impacts and preparing for the future. These are the types of projects that Natick had submitted and considered. Julie mentioned the prioritization process that the team has been undergoing over the past few months under the Phase 2. And these are some of the projects that Natick had submitted and similar to what other communities in the watershed submitted. So we looked at larger municipal owned lots that have undeveloped spaces, a farm located along a tributary to the Charles River, privately owned undeveloped parcels that frequently flood, and segment of a heavily traveled roadway corridor, which also frequently floods. And this red text are some of the interventions or projects that could potentially build on those properties. Things like detention basins, optimized vegetated riparian buffers is just a fancy way of saying more vegetated strips along the brooks and the streams that lead to the river. Land protection, and then green infrastructure, which you probably noticed the theme green infrastructure comes up a lot in this work. If you attended our virtual sessions last year under Phase 1, these slides are probably going to look familiar to you. I wanted to take some snapshots from the actual flood model of an area in Natick that jumped out to us in Natick in terms of flooding events. So on the screen here, this gray solid line that runs from northeast to southwest is Route 27, which is a main corridor in town. This black solid line is the town line. So north we have Natick, and then south we have Sherburne. The Indian Brook is this lighter, softer blue line, and then this colored marshland looking area that surrounds it as wetlands. So this blue polygon represents the flooding extent that the model is telling us under 100-year storm present. When we toggle on the 100-year storm for the future scenario, we see that that flooding extent grows quite a bit. So this is a side-by-side comparison. And this is really important because this is not only an area that straddles our town line and impacts the town of Sherburne and the town of Natick, it's affecting Route 27, which is, as I mentioned, a major roadway corridor for people traveling through our communities. So when we saw this, we started to think, what can we do in these areas? What kind of projects, what kind of stormwater projects can we implement to get ahead of these impacts? And one of the things we can consider is a green streets analysis where we examine different green infrastructure types that we can put onto Route 27 and implement along Route 27 to help absorb some of that stormwater. Another thing we can do is we can look at private land that might be surrounding the area and talk to those property owners and consider protecting those properties. When you protect a private property from future development, you also protect it in terms of preventing future additional impervious surfaces from being created, such as parking lots and buildings, which would also help to absorb the stormwater. So these are just the project goals reiterated in a little bit of detail in terms of our Phase 2 Charles River flood model work. But as we are mentioning quite a bit tonight, one of the main goals is to create design for some specific projects and sites. These projects contain this criteria shown on the screen here. Julie mentioned these, so I won't go into them in a lot of detail. But the survey that will be shared at the end of tonight's presentation will allow you to give us your input for project ideas in your community or in the region, in addition to a number of other options and questions. So that's my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing and pass it over to Leigh to talk about community engagement.
Okay, great. Everyone can hear me okay? Thumbs up. Excellent. So thank you, Marianne. Just want to say welcome to everyone, and one, just express deep gratitude for the opportunity to be a part of this work. Just for me, and part of what I think communities responding to extreme weather can bring to this is a mindset. I know Julie was talking about shifts in mindsets and how we can sort of see within some of these framings or limitations or the things that feel heavy around, oh my gosh, there's so much flooding and what's happening and what opportunities can actually come from some of these struggles. So I just feel really grateful to kind of, in whatever way I can and our team at CREW can help facilitate the shifts in mindsets, as well as doing a lot of the on the ground work related to community engagement as part of the Charles River Flood Model Project. So yeah, so just real quick, a quick introduction to myself again. I'm going to, as was mentioned at the beginning, thank you, Dira, for introducing me and pronouncing my last name beautifully. I appreciate it. And it can be a mouthful. But yeah, so I'm just serving as project coordinator simply with CREW, when we have a team of 4 of us who are going to be working on Crew's End with the team at CRWA and Weston and Sampson. And I think before we sort of jump into what I'm primarily going to focus on, which was when Julie brought up the scope of work for the project, there was a line item there that was focusing on public engagement. And that's mainly what I'm going to be speaking to this evening, because that will be CREW's sort of primary focus or purpose within the project. But before jumping in that, we also want to do a quick poll here. So thank you, Julia. Whenever you pull that up, I'm just going to read off the question here. And so the question being, and it'll probably make sense as soon as you read this, why we're asking it. So in the last year or two, everyone's aware probably what's been happening in the last year or two and how it's been different since beforehand. How have you helped your community respond to and cope with stress or struggles? And so in this particular question, it's a little bit different because you actually can choose multiple. So in this case, you're going to choose as many as apply. You're going to find that I'll read these off actually while people are choosing. But again, if you don't see any here, you actually don't have to choose none, or because you're not going to have to respond at all. But then if there's another way, you can always just choose other ways of building community. So some of the options here, and there's going to be a lot of overlap, right? So just getting to know your neighbors better, you prepared and or distributed supplies. It's things like food, clothing, emergency supplies, and masks, volunteered with local community groups, shared artistic and music expression, created spaces and activities for connection, movement, and mindfulness. So that's things like potlucks, walks, calls. I mean, these are the simple things that I think we take for granted and think don't necessarily identify as things that we're actively doing in the community, but we're doing all the time in relationship with each other. You organized or participated in deliberately in trainings or workshops that build skills. That could be everything from learning a new language, gardening, emergency response, even meditation, super important, right? How can we be in stillness and find some stillness in these times? Participating in direct actions and solidarity events, advocating for policies and decision-making that address systemic issues. So what that option really means is thinking about whatever was the causes of the stress, right? So in what ways are we addressing some of the root causes or things that are making the stress happen in the first place? And often those are broader systemic issues. And then any other ways that you could think of that you've been involved in building community. So I'll give it maybe another 15, 20 seconds for people to be able to respond. So again, the question being, in the last couple of years, how have you helped your community respond to and cope with stress or struggles? So Julia, maybe we can close that out and see what people came back with. Amazing. And if I can, I just would love to lift up maybe a couple of these here. Like the fact that the winning is just getting to know your neighbors better. I just think that's amazing. Like just much gratitude to everybody here just for taking that kind of step, to just looking to who's directly around you and in what ways can you just just the simplest level be building relationships with people and supporting each other that are in a way that's closest to you. As crew is often involved in a lot of projects, and a lot of the education that we do is actually in that kind of work and is reminding people just how important those social connections are. And it's actually the community, a lot of studies show that it's actually the communities that are where neighbors do know each other better that fare best whenever there is a crisis. So that's awesome. Okay, awesome. Thank you, Julia. All right, so as you can imagine, given the framing of this particular event tonight, building resilience, and the project itself, the question that I just asked you was really in connection with, I could have just, in a lot of ways, I said, how have you helped your community respond to and cope with stress or struggles? And it really was, how have you helped your community build resilience? And I'm also experiencing delays. Okay, let's see what happens here. I'm just going to give it a second. If it doesn't work, I might pull this out of presentation mode just so people know, and I'll do it slide by slide myself. So just want to.
Did you try your arrow key?
I did.
And it's
Leigh, when it happened to me, I clicked out of the window and went back in, and then it worked. Excuse me. The arrow keys worked. I don't know if it just had to refresh its mind or something.
Like
Right.
just leave and come back in.
Yeah.
Ah, Marianne, you're a genius.
I wouldn't go that far.
held by the community. That's a genius that is informed by others as well, who allowed you to be a curious person and figure that stuff out. So thank you. Okay, so again, what you all just did was talked about all the ways in which you are amazingly resilient and support it. So we're going to take a little bit of a look here at, even with the framing here of what is climate resilience, what I have often found is that a lot of the ways in which we're building resilience in regards to climate, there's so much overlap with other ways of cultivating resilience. So the broader definition of resilience, and there are so many, the one we've lifted up here this evening is resilience is basically the process, and I can't emphasize that enough, that resilience is a continuing process. It's not something that's finite and that ends or begins at any one time. It's a process of adapting well, or in some cases even thriving in the face of adversity, crises, trauma, tragedy, or other sources of stress. So in regards to this particular project, when we talk about flooding, the sources of stress we're speaking to are climate change and the impacts of that. So, and obviously here we're focusing on flooding, but some other extreme weather events that are part of that and that can cause flooding or exacerbate flooding are unpredictable storms, increased precipitation, obviously flooding that's specific to rivers, and sea level rise. So thinking along our shorelines. And then just you all spoke to some specific behaviors or actions that cultivate resilience. And in this case, I'm just sort of gathering those in some kind of larger resilience umbrellas, if you will. So what can cultivating resilience look like? Some examples here are those trainings that you might have participated in. So thinking about preparedness, education, and skill building. We have things along the line of community service and mutual aid, which I feel like, especially in the last couple years with COVID, has become a term that people have become more familiar with. And then thinking about some of those more direct actions or policymaking stuff. So how have we also cultivated resilience in a way that's increasing equity and empowerment in decision-making and resource distribution? So crew is heavily involved in this kind of work of cultivating resilience. CREW is a network of local leaders building grassroots climate resilience through inclusive and hands-on education, service, and planning. And I'll just continue here reading off. Together, we're working to equip families and communities with resources and capacity to prepare for and respond to local climate changes. And then here comes some buzzwords that you've probably heard a lot, may not be fully understanding on, and that's okay. Equitably, sustainably, and collaboratively. So thinking back to 2 slides ago, when I sort of gave those larger buckets of how, how we can cultivate resilience, what does that look like? The way that CREW serves communities and cultivates climate resilience within those buckets or under those umbrellas. Here's just some examples I wanted to lift up for you all, some of which actually overlap, which actually is what makes me excited about the work with the Charles River Watershed Association, because CREW is actually doing a lot of this stuff as well. It just looks a little bit different. So under preparedness, education, skill building, we host emergency preparedness workshops and different kinds of intersectionality events. On our website, climatecrew.org, which I'll show on another slide later, there's a lot of great resources that you can access there. I want to lift up Climate Preparedness Week, which is always the last week of September. You actually in your community could get your city council to pass a resolution to declare that last week Climate Preparedness Week. And what that does, allows space in the year for events like this one to be amplified, right? And for asking your municipality to commit to climate preparedness as just as at least within the calendar, right? Actually identifying a time in the year for people to really focus on these issues. And under community service and mutual aid, I wanted to lift up depaving. So as was mentioned earlier, I live in Somerville. Some people here might be familiar with, some not. We actually do these depaving parties. So it's actually implementing some of these nature-based strategies on sort of a more personal or like sort of private land by private land or, home by home level. And so just, again, this is the stuff that I get really excited about and part of what makes me stoked on working with CRWA on this project because of the focus on green infrastructure and those kinds of solutions and not simply tech solutions. And so depaving that we do in Somerville and some of these depaving parties are sort of smaller scale examples of that. And then lastly, under increased equity, empowerment, and connection, a couple things to lift up. A Climate Resilience Hub program. Resilience hubs is just a fancy term, again, for just how different locations that already exist. Libraries make fantastic resilience hubs. So what are these spaces that are in a lot of ways already exist in our communities that we could really ensure have resources and direct relationships to the community. So when there is a crisis, people have them to turn to. So as Julie mentioned a couple of these earlier, but I wanted to just re-emphasize them here, especially in regards to the community engagement aspect of this work. So how will CREW support climate resilience in the Charles River Watershed, especially CRWA's flood modeling work and climate adaptation response efforts? So a lot of it is through partnership. So CREW and CRWA, Weston and Sampson as well, and obviously and then Natick. And so specific in this partnership, we're focusing on public engagement. And a lot of that, and I'll just read off some of the examples here, is really to raise awareness, obviously, about the work that had been done last year and now is brought forward to this year. So the flood model is complete. Now there's results. How are we raising awareness of how those results can be received, right, by the community and actually applied in the real world? Connecting communities across the watershed, as Julie mentioned, to share ideas and experiences and support more holistic or systems thinking, right? So water flows downstream. So we need to be thinking in a way that is more expansive and understands sort of the interconnectedness of all living beings and Earth. Gathering input on the CRWA's implementation plan. And again, a large focus of CREW's work here is going to be engaging specifically with environmental justice populations and residents in the communities where a lot of these nature-based projects are going to be implemented. I did want to just lift up because, especially for me, I'm recognizing that phase 1 happened last year. I was not the coordinator and I'm coming in new here, not to CREW itself, but to this particular project. So for me, it's really important, I think, to kind of lift up what worked well, what didn't, and how that's going to inform community engagement going forward. And what, from my understanding, is from speaking with people who were involved in phase one. There's an abundance of successes to draw from here. One was just, especially during a pandemic, how incredible the participation was last year, and that the ways in which that participation actually is informing what's happening now. So phase one feedback helped define a lot of the modeling scenarios, both the storms and then what was lifted up as far as some of these nature-based solutions. Some of the learnings from last year as well. One is the importance of increasing resources to support inclusion and to build trust. For me, that's really close to my heart, right? Because I used to be as an educator for many years, as Dira lifted up. And so you could talk over and over and over again a particular way, but if the person on the receiving end doesn't trust me in the offering, right, of particular information, or it's not being shared in a way that's meaningful to them, I could talk to them blue in the face and it's not going to matter. So any ways that we can sort of be increasing resources to address those things and create a more inclusive and dynamic engagement process for this project, I'm super stoked on. And part of that is some specific feedback was actually coming up with more clear and concise, accessible digital engagement materials. So my understanding is, for example, in this phase, rather than sending people long videos of everything, right? What's the stuff that's most meaningful to them? Let's get videos created and get that to people. So, so I'm really excited about that. I'm just going to run through this. So when we think about inclusion or inclusivity and how to do it, again, people have probably heard a lot of different buzzwords around equitable, and again, I mentioned sustainability and how to collaborate, right? And a lot of times we can sort of feel like, well, the more voices we have involved, more overwhelming it is. If there's more people involved, like that's more stuff we have to consider. There's more work to do there. And I want to recognize, like for myself, I find a lot of joy kind of getting into that muck and mire, but for a lot of people, it can feel very overwhelming, and understandably so when we don't necessarily have the skills to do it. And what happens often is if we don't feel skilled in something, we may just decide to ignore it because we don't want to risk harming other people, right? Often it's from a good place, a good intention. It's not necessarily that we intentionally want to ignore people, but a lot of times it has to do with not necessarily feeling skilled or well supported in doing that kind of work. So what are the things that can help us in that way? So things that I'm just going to read off here. So slowing down and building trust first, like I mentioned, being able to admit when we don't know something and asking for help is huge. Making room for risks, creativity, and be able to say, I'm sorry when something doesn't go a particular way is really big and really hard for a lot of us. Probably all of us, depending on the scenario. Committing to process and centering relationship as part of this, and allowing those things to help facilitate the outcomes that we're seeking or we're hoping for. Prioritizing the lived experiences and wisdom of communities, making that a part of our expertise umbrella. So seeing people and valuing people as opposed to a role. Addressing accessibility issues, and that's things like if anybody here is involved with community groups, the importance of making sure people are fed, that there's childcare, language support. So these are some of the basic meetings that aren't happening at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a Tuesday, right? So how are we making sure that we're making spaces as accessible as possible to people? And then asking people directly. Sometimes that's the simplest thing, is if you're not sure what to do, just ask people what if you want to be included on this, what do I need to offer you in order for you to feel like you can participate meaningfully here. And
Leigh,
then
I'm just gonna give you a 2-minute
no problem
notice so we can get to enough time for questions.
You got it, no problem. And so I just have a list here of some people who can definitely help you out in this case. You're not alone, right? So the community members can help, leaders of those communities if you're not sure who to contact. And then there's some really great examples here. The Consensus Building Institute, Racial Justice Collaborative, and we here at CREW are happy to help you with that. On this slide, I'll just real quick, engaging who and how. I'm just going to stick to the left-hand side of the slide because that's going to be our focus. We're focused on the watershed residents. So as you're seeing here, these are just some examples of ways in which CREW specifically is going to be working on this project. And again, the focus really is on environmental justice and climate vulnerable populations and priority project communities. And for the sake of time, I'm going to move on. Lifting up again, just the importance of, I already said this on another slide a little bit, but just it's so important to value all stakeholders and all kinds of knowing. So just, we want to make sure we're doing that as much as we can. And that's what crew is going to commit to as part of this process. And lifting up as well, that when we don't do that, and I'm just looking at the bottom of the slide here, that there potential harm can happen when we don't do that part of the work. It's all part of the work. And also the projects aren't necessarily successful. How often have we done a project and found that because we left people out, now we're doing a lot more work on the tail end because we didn't do that work up front. And again, for the sake of time, so just how and where can you find info? These are just some links. Lifting up again, flooding and impacts. CRWA's website has some wonderful story maps and the flood model itself. And then on community response and resilience, there's just some examples here as well. Again, there will be a recording of this, so you'll have the direct links. And as Julie said, I just wanted to give another plug. There's going to be a survey that you'll get to participate in this evening when you get the follow-up email. And please reach out to me as well. I mean, I'm going to be super stoked on hearing anything from you all as far as accessing the tool, the website, any sort of hurdles there. And then if you have any ideas for who and when and how we can connect with environmental justice and climate vulnerable communities, I'm excited to hear that. And I'm going to just jump right to the end. And I want to give a quick shout out to Jess, Aria, and Olivia, who may hopefully are here tonight as well, but they are part of our team. And thank you. And back to Julie.
Thank you, Leigh. That was great. Thank you so much. I was going to give one last plug for getting input, but I feel like we've exhausted that topic. I do want to give a quick shout out to our technical partner, Weston and Sampson. Those video recordings I mentioned back from January and June 2021. You can see some of their great technical staff going into the more technical details of the model, if that's interest to you. So I think we should just jump right into the questions though, Dira. Why don't we just jump right into the Q&A?
That sounds great. Yeah, I'm going to ask Julia to spotlight all of us so that people can also see our faces when we're answering the questions. We got a couple of really good questions in the Q&A, and just a reminder for people that if you do have questions, please use the Q&A option so that we can see our questions and answer them. So I'll go right in. The first question is from Catherine. She says, before the CRWA was founded, the League of Women Voters conducted a study that concluded preserving wetlands. A study that concluded preserving wetlands would be more cost effective than building levees to control flooding. How much worse would flooding be in the watershed if the Corps of Engineers had not implemented the League's recommendations? And then another question she had, another question has to do with the role of the long ditch that connects the Charles with the Neponset River in preventing flooding.
Okay, that is an awesome question. So I for folks that don't know this story, I'll give the 30-second version. But there was some severe flooding in the 50s from a Hurricane Diane, I believe it was, throughout the watershed. And so the Army Corps came in, did their normal thing, wanted to build levees, very infrastructure heavy flood control projects. And then as our question asker is referring to, we had just an awesome team, from my understanding, of local concerned residents who asked them to look at this nature-based solution, preserving the wetlands. And so we have today the Natural Valley Storage Area, which is basically a series of wetlands, about 8,000 acres of wetlands throughout the watershed. It's not all in one spot, it's all over. It's in 16 different communities. And they're preserved and protected, and they act as a sponge. They really hold the water so that when we get a lot of rain, it can be stored, and then it can slowly trickle down the river when we need it. So that's an awesome success story that we tout at CRWA since I think it was two ago executive directors was involved in all of that, and getting that preserved and protected. And I just have to say, when we started the Climate Compact, that story was known to a lot of our municipal colleagues, and real interest in expanding that. So that's very much in the in line in the theme of what we're trying to do here with this project. So it's hard to, I don't have a straight answer as far as how much worse exactly would it be. I can tell you it would be a lot worse, because as Marianne referenced in her talk, one of the things we looked at in the modeling results we've already done was, what if all this area that's right now undeveloped was developed? And that was really one of the most impactful scenarios. Flooding got a lot worse. So our wetlands, just even our undeveloped, grass area, meadow areas, I should say, forested areas, they're all offering a little bit of flood protection right now. And if we're not acknowledging that, allowing that to be developed, it is going to get worse. So in the Army Corps' solution with the Natural Valley Storage Area, they did acknowledge that. They bought those lands and protected those lands. So that's great. Yeah, and then on the long ditch, that's an interesting one. It's a little weird. It sort of has a historic context in development. Well, I shouldn't call it weird, but it's a little unusual maybe. It directs water from the Charles into the Neponset. So it does have some potential to provide flood control, but I guess another reason to really understand regional impacts, because we wouldn't want to divert our flooding just into the Neponset. And Julia has shared in the chat our awesome story map about the Natural Valley flood storage area. So that's great for folks who want to learn more. Thanks, Julia.
Great. Leigh and Marianne, do you both have anything else to add, or can I move on to the next question? Okay, so the next question is about the flood model itself. Will the model continue to be calibrated with future major storm events to improve its accuracy?
Yes, we plan to continually maintain and update, which would include either calibration or just validation, just running it on a storm. We're doing some of that right now. Unfortunately, we did get some pretty significant rain events this summer, with catching the tail end of some of those hurricanes in late August, early September. So from that, we've gotten some feedback from our municipal partners about what they saw, what impacts did they see, what roads did they see flooded. And from that, basically from that input, we're using that to sort of validate and correct, adjust some things in the model as needed. So yes, we will continue to maintain that and update that.
Great. And the last question we have right now is, by when will you be asking for community input on specific projects for consideration in phase 2? Maybe Julie and Marianne, you could both pitch in.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the survey that's going to pop up, we're asking folks to complete it within a week. I would say that at this point, we would be wondering about, we're not necessarily we're not necessarily asking folks to sort of start from scratch. So we're not charging you with thinking about, what might work or what might, be possible in your community. That would be a big ask, and we would give you more than a week for that. For the suggestions we're looking for right now, since we are kind of focused on what might be implemented in, the nearest term, like, maybe the next decade or so, because these things do take time. So we're mostly asking for, if you're involved in something, if you're part of a community group, if you're part of a land trust, if you're part of a lake association, maybe you're on the open space commission in your community, whatever it may be. So if you're sort of involved in a group, however formal or informal, that's, you know, got some ideas around this, those are the kind of ideas we're soliciting. So don't feel stressed if you don't have any ideas. And this is an ongoing project. So maybe when we come back to you at the next meeting, maybe you have an idea then and you can raise it then. So good clarification. Marianne, do you want to say anything else about the projects or ideas?
It's not easy. It seems like as you're going about your life, you think of a million projects, and then when an opportunity comes up to actually implement it, you can't think of any of the projects. But I mean, maybe you drive in a neighborhood in your community that floods a ton during some rain events that don't even seem like significant rain events. You can reach out to us maybe and see if that's something that we can consider. But it's definitely not an easy task.
All right. Next question that we have. So preventing flooding is essential, right? Critical and crucial, that we need more flood control. And that would probably mean that town council need to understand that they can't keep opening land to development. For example, maybe converting some of that land to large golf courses. And a reminder that the UN says that there isn't any time for us to really think about what, you know, we need to do. Like, this is the time for action. Can any of you kind of provide any insight or input of how we can convince the public about that?
I'll chime in a little bit to that one. That's always a big question. People are very busy these days. We get paid to do a lot of this work, and we have the volunteers in our own lives, but that's the big thing, is trying to get people engaged, educated about it, and learn about it some more. I wanted to touch on, now I can't find the question, about the town allowing land to be developed. So that's also really complicated, but the way the town can be involved and allow better development to move forward is through the permitting process. So a lot of developers and residents may groan about filing for building permits, but there's definitely a point to all that. And when you have to go through the zoning board, the planning board, or the conservation commission, it definitely does take some time. But the whole effort in that is to try to get a better thought out process and project built at the end of the day. So I had mentioned that in Natick a couple years ago, we adopted a new stormwater bylaw, and it was hard to roll it out because a lot of developers, we had to tell them that there's a new stormwater permit they had to file. And the point of that was that our town staff, our engineers, and sometimes our conservation commission would have to review those projects and see how they are mitigating stormwater impacts. And it makes sense to do that, but it's definitely an added cost to developers when they're building projects, and even residential homeowners when they're building projects if it's big enough. But there's ways that the town and the residents can be involved with allowing better development, right? And redeveloping sites. Infill development is always good too. Instead of taking a green space and plopping a house in a parking lot there, or a business in a parking lot, considering some of these underutilized areas that have previously been developed is always a good thing. And open space protection. That's my big thing, is always balancing the development community and the urban community side with open spaces for environmental reasons, but for recreational reasons too.
Yeah. Yes, Leigh, go ahead.
Yeah, maybe one other piece I can just speak to here, because I want to recognize capacity, and often, speaking from experience, at least here in Somerville, on a community level, and how often, because staff or whoever might lack capacity, the ability to like offer opportunities for community involvement in that process can feel burdensome, because I only have so much capacity in my schedule. And so it's so important for community members in a lot of ways to themselves connect, and ways you can do that. I know in Somerville, we develop neighborhood councils and associations that are, working on community benefits agreements. And there's a lot of different tools that exist and can be accessed in negotiations with developers. And what that often requires is community members themselves. Often relationships with counselors is also huge here. So being able to engage your city council, to be advocates and to be a bridge in some ways with developers, and getting people to sort of expanding that table and bringing people together. But I'll lift up one particular tool, like I mentioned, was a community benefits agreement. If you look that up and see, if you're like, what the heck is that? Is one way to kind of weave in some of these green infrastructure pieces. But it often is about community members, I think, coming together and creating a more formalized structure within a neighborhood that other community members can then come to with their concerns and ideas.
Yeah, great point, Leigh. And someone else just chatted me that, thinking about redevelopment as, in some ways, but an opportunity to potentially build in resilience to the landscape, especially if, some of the sites we might look at for this project, could be very old, all pavements, not really used, or sort of a gravel. So it can be an opportunity.
Great. We have another question, but before I go to that, I wanted to kind of follow up on both what Leigh and Marianne mentioned, and ask another question that maybe Marianne, you have a little more insight on. So the model has kind of been out for a little bit. Do you have any insight on how the residents or community members have reacted to the flood model?
I don't think a lot of residents are informed about it yet. We've done some outreach in terms of internally. We've gone to some of our boards to share the results and let them know what's going on with the project. But I definitely think that something that all of the communities, all 20 communities that are involved, we need to do more outreach at the local level, and share the fact that this exists, this flood model, and residents can take a look at it and see, connect the dots in terms of what the town is talking about, maybe put together some grassroots activities and efforts. I mean, we have a sustainability committee, so we'll probably have to go to them too. And it's going to take some time, but spreading the word is going to be huge.
Great, thanks so much. So in the interest of time, and I think we might have already gone over our said scheduled time, I would just like to wrap up while we still have a couple people here. Maybe I can share my screen really quickly.
I can pop up the last slide, Dira.
Or can you share your screen, Julie? Perfect.
Yes. Yeah.
So thank you everyone for attending our virtual event series. Please feel free to stay involved in our upcoming virtual events, including a workshop or a webinar on dam removal. You can find all of this on our website, crwa.org. We also have all of our past virtual events on the website as well, and you can take a look at some of our resources that have been mentioned throughout the workshop or webinar, and get some more information on some of the really great climate resiliency things that are being done in our watershed. And to keep in touch with what we're doing, also sign up to our River Current, which is our newsletter, so that you can stay in the know of everything that's happening. All right, and I want to thank our panel for attending and answering some really great questions. I hope everyone has a good night and hopefully stay warm with this weather that's coming up the end of the week. And we hope to see you guys around another time. Have a good night, everyone.
And thank you, Dira.